Okay, hi everyone. I'm Graham Smith from Republic in the UK. I'm joined here by Floris Muller and Ollie Dikvist from Netherlands and Sweden, respectively. So this is the last in a series of these AERM live streams. The previous ones have looked at things like the funding, the finances of the monarchy, whether or not there's any room for compromise, getting a bicycling monarchy, that sort of thing. So today we're kind of looking to the future, being optimistic as we always are, and thinking about what sort of republic we want. It's probably different in each country to some extent, but I don't know that any of us necessarily want a US-style republic. The question, sort of the options on offer are usually broadly talked about in terms of the Irish system, a parliamentary model, or the French system, or a US system. But there are variations within the parliamentary system within European republics. So the US system is obviously the most well-known, I guess, where you have one head of state who is also head of government. They have a very separate parliament, if you like, the Congress, which is completely separate from the head of state. And the president is the executive. He's directly elected, or well, sort of directly elected, if you forget the college system. And the more common models in Europe are parliamentary. So you have Ireland, where you have a directly elected head of state who has very limited constitutional powers. So, for example, Michael D. Higgins, the current president of Ireland, can refuse to sign an act of parliament into law if he thinks it's unconstitutional, but can't do it for any other reason. And he will have some limited reserve powers in times of crisis or stalemate, for example. And that's quite common also. Places like Italy and Greece have a similar model, but those heads of state are not directly elected. Germany is very similar. Then you have France, where the president is the head of state and has a executive political role, but that role is split with the prime minister, who is drawn from the parliament. And there are, I think, similarities there with a number of other European republics. I think Finland is similar, and it sort of varies depending on the degree to which the president has independent political power. So these are not ceremonial roles, and it's often said, we would have a ceremonial figurehead. Well, none of these heads of state are purely ceremonial. They are constitutional is a better word for them. So they have constitutional function, which is usually reserved for times of crisis, paralysis, and stalemate. So, for example, a number of these heads of state will play the role of inviting someone to form a government in the same way that the Queen does in the UK, but they can exercise some judgment on that if there is uncertainty as to who can actually command a majority. And sometimes this can be very difficult, and it is very useful to have that head of state playing that role. That role is also, by the way, played by the King of Belgium. Now, the big difference, and to some extent the King of Spain, I think, as well, where they've been more active and involved in appointing governments where the numbers in Parliament haven't been entirely clear. The big difference is that these are serious, important decisions, and those people need to be very, very much accountable for what those decisions are. And there have been resignations of presidents in Germany and Ireland, particularly when they've made decisions or done things which have not gone down too well. So they hold accountable, which is absolutely the right way to do it. But we can't do that with kings and queens. So we're going to have a bit of a chat about that, about which model each of our three countries sort of prefers, which one we propose, if we propose one, what public opinion is like in terms of which models are most likely to be preferred. And I guess that it is probably going to be different for each of us as to which countries we look to for some kind of inspiration. So, I think I've always said and made it clear that in the UK, our inspiration is the Republic of Ireland, because it is a Westminster system, it's parliamentary democracy, and they have a directly elected head of state. I mean, Floris and Ollie, do you look to other countries for an alternative model, or is it something which is that you sort of don't settle on, or what's your position on that?
I can start and say, like, we look to primarily Finland and Iceland, like culturally our neighbors in Scandinavia and whatnot. However, we only do that from the context of broadening the idea of presidential systems, because as you said, most people, when they think of a president, they think of the US. And right now, well, that is, to be quite honest, not a good thing for us. But we broaden the discussion and say, well, we have other presidential systems, and look at Finland, look at Iceland, they're our neighbors. But as an organization, we do not take a position on which kind of system we would like, because we've made the decision again and again. This is always a motion, basically, on our General Assembly to say that we do not want to divide the Republican cause over this. So as an organization, we're like a broad church of all of these principles, all these systems.
And Floris, is that a similar situation in Ireland?
Well, I must say that in the Netherlands, the Republican Society in the Netherlands, we do not make a stance for one particular form of republic. But we have asked over 5,000 people in the Netherlands, the members of the Republican Society, which kind of republic do you prefer? And without really pointing at one country or another, it came out that 80% of all people preferred a more parliamentary system in which the parliament had all its power. Well, the stronghold of power is in Parliament. I must say that and having had a lot of debates within or with our members and in our General Assembly, most people do not favor a very strong president. They do not favor a very strong representative. So it would be the more parliamentary system.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is true here. There's, I think you've had some polling in the Netherlands not that long ago. We did polling a very long time ago, 15 years ago, I think it was the last time we asked this question, which is, if we were going to have a republic, which one would you prefer? And the parliamentary model was by far the most popular. And I know that I mean, personally, I talk about the US model, let's sort of deal with that, because on paper it's great, and it was revolutionary at the time, and it's still got a lot going for it. I think that the failings in that are sort of cultural and political more than anything else. The Constitution is pretty solid. It has been changed 17 times since the original first 10 amendments. So this idea that it's fixed and you can't change it, and it's because they got a written constitution, that's why they've got the right to bear arms. I mean, they can, if they want to, remove that right, but that's a political and cultural decision not to. So, so I think it's good in a way, but I think the parliamentary systems are superior for a number of reasons. And I think that if governments are in Parliament and have to be held to account by Parliament, and can be brought down by Parliament, I think that's much more powerful than having a single person who's fixed in that position for their term. So, and I think that having those limited powers for the president works. I think there's a role to play for head of state in that context.
If I could just make a short comment in between. Our comments pages are open. As I understood, you can just log into any Facebook page of any Republican Society, whether at the British or the Swedish, and leave your comments. I see a lot of comments coming in. and a lot of debates among people commenting. What I think would be the most interesting, if to hear from people watching, what kind of republic do you prefer, and do you have any questions about the different models as described by Graham, just to get a little bit more debate going on?
Yeah, and I'd like to comment on Graham there. We also did polling internally in the organization. Unfortunately, it was a long time ago, and I can't remember what the result was. However, I imagine the parliamentary model would probably be very popular. I would, though, add for myself, I like the parliamentary model as well, but I do see some positive things with a directly elected president as well, especially coming from a parliamentary system that's based primarily around parties in Sweden. Like in the UK, you do the first past the post vote, and you vote basically for a person, whereas we vote primarily for parties. We have very little control over the people in those parties. So I do see some it would be beneficial in some ways to actually have one position in government that we could sort of control person-wise.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the thing, though. I think what I've picked up when I've spoken to you guys and also the Republican movements from the other countries is that the options for change are quite often influenced by existing structures and cultures, and of course who you're most familiar with in terms of your next door neighbours. So I imagine you are more familiar with Finland than Ireland, for example, if you're in Sweden. So I think that we elect parties, but I mean it's very much based on who the people are at the top, I guess. But there are so many other things wrong with the British Constitution. There's almost nothing right with it, really. But I think there's a big debate about changing the electoral system as well to make it fairer, so that you can choose both party and person. There's lots of different things you can do with that. What I was going to pick up on is one of the reasons why we do say quite explicitly which model we propose, which is the Irish parliamentary model. It's twofold, really. Firstly, we know that is widely acceptable. It's not a revolutionary change. It's a major change, but it's a change from it's essentially taking what we already have but making it democratic. So it's not completely redesigning the system. It's making the current system democratic right the way through. I think there's just I think we sort of looked to Australia and thought that they got very much tied up in knots around which model they're going to have. And they've never really settled on what that model is. And I think that having a clear alternative on offer has worked for us, not least because it kills the idea, there's so many times I get into a debate and people say, oh, well, we don't want Trump. And I said, well, we're not arguing for the US model, so that's not an issue. So, and they don't really know what to say to that because they've gone into that debate expecting that to be the argument. So, and having a very clear alternative, I think, is really useful. But it works.
I have a question for both of you, actually.
Go ahead.
As you just said, Graham, that people the same in the Netherlands. What would you rather have, a Trump or the monarchy as it is right now? Do you feel it as your role to explain the different kinds of republics and to actually say, well, we are not making a choice for a particular system, but this would be the most reasonable?
So was that to me?
That was, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't catch the start of your sentence.
Well,
we don't really explain. I mean, we argue for a republic, and most a substantial part of that discussion is about what's wrong with the current system, and to some extent, we are saying to people what the monarchist argues we don't have an independent, neutral head of state who's above politics, but we should have, which is someone who's elected and can be accountable for making sure they do that. And we just try and stick to that argument, really. We don't really get into all the other models too much, unless people are arguing from the other side, saying, you know, you're going to get Bush or Trump or whatever. So we tend to just, we don't, and this helps us really, because most people don't really want to get into that detail either. You know, they're listening to the argument for the first time, and it's a very easy way of making a much safer choice, an understandable choice, when we're saying take everything we've got at the moment, keep it, make it more democratic. Elected upper house instead of the Lords, elected president with real independence, but you still have the Prime Minister in the House of Commons and so on. So, yeah, I did see a question earlier about whether or not I ever brush my hair. So
yeah, I saw that as well.
Not often, no, but I sort of looked at my hands. Anyway, so yeah, I don't know whether that answers your question.
Well, another question then to Olle is what we've never went into that with the general public, but in debates with people who question the idea of republic, they say, well, you know, what's the alternative? And our basic reply is, well, we are not choosing for a particular republican system. It makes it rather difficult to argument that you do want to get rid of the monarchy, but we are not going into depths into what kind of system we want it to replace with. How do you see that?
No, I wholeheartedly disagree. Actually, by being very free, it allows me to be creative in those debates and say, because I usually meet someone saying, well, what do you propose? And I'm like, well, what do you want? I have these 5-10 propositions on how we could make this work, how this system could be set up. And do you lack any form of imagination? Like this isn't hard to imagine, really. For me, I feel it's been a positive thing in debates to have that, to point to a variety of systems and be like, we can choose one. We just need to do that. Yeah. And also, I'd like to go back. I'm catching a bit of flack in the comments for the way I presented the UK electoral system. No, you don't vote for a single person, but the system is set up so the candidates are very clear. And when you choose representatives, that's what I meant. It's more abstracted in the Swedish version. It's much more party based. But yes, you don't vote for a person. I get that, you vote for parties.
Yeah, and I think that's very particular to your voting system as well.
Yes, exactly. It's very abstracted.
I would say though, I mean, in terms of going back to your position on offering a choice, I mean, we always say, look, you know, this is our position. This is what we argue, and we're essentially saying this is very easy to do. It's not a huge step. It's a democratic step. But if people start arguing, you know, there are other ways of doing this, the Swiss model, for example, we always come back and say, well, look, you know, Britain is never going to ask me or the Republic to write the next constitution. You know, it's going to be up for discussion. So it's always going to be part of the process to decide which model it's going to be. So whether we argue for it or for a particular model or not, it's always going to be there for the people to decide when we get there. But I mean, you know, I also think that it's almost certainly going to be that people will want to keep the basic structure but make it democratic. And I think, I mean, Ireland is not perfect. I think they have a number of unelected people in the upper house, and they have a close relationship with the Catholic Church, and there are parts of their constitution which I would change, but broadly speaking, it's pretty good. And their heads of state, certainly for the last 30 years, have been fantastic. You know, they are there to essentially represent Ireland, the Irish people in Ireland, and also the Irish diaspora, and they do that very well, I think. So, yeah, there's a few questions there that are directed at me about British monarchy, so I'll try. I might jump in and answer them a bit later. But on the Ollie, which country would you say that you look to the most in terms of for inspiration as to how it might work?
That's actually a good question, because honestly, whenever I envision our republican system. I am one of those people who I base my idea around the existing system and how you can just fit that into Republican scheme. So for me, it would pretty much be identical to how it is today, but we would remove the king as the head of state and allow our prime minister to be the same. And then all of those ceremonial things that the king still does in government would basically be placed on the Speaker of the House or the Speaker of Parliament. So I feel like it's not a system that necessarily exists, but it would be a sort of parliamentary system. It would be one of the parliamentary systems, I would say. And I don't look to, for instance, Finland, who has an elected president. But that's my personal opinion.
Yeah. And Floris, do you look to Germany or to?
Well, I must say that again, we have different systems. We as Republicans look at. We do not make a choice in that, but because I think it's very interesting that the British look at Ireland, the Swedes look at other countries in a very close neighborhood. I don't think that Germany is our biggest example in that. There obviously, I think that Germany and Belgium are both resemble our country the most historically, culturally. But Belgium is a monarchy, and Germany has a presidential system in which that doesn't really relate to the Dutch. I think as Germany is very centralized, Berlin is obviously that is the strong capital. Holland is not. We are very decentralized. We don't have that culture of a very strong government. We've had provinces throughout our history. So to look at a neighbor for a very strong example, I think that's very, very difficult for the Dutch. But again, I think we would go for a more parliamentary system.
Yeah.
And that could be either maybe the Irish or the Finnish or it's very difficult to find a system that would really fit the Dutch, I think.
Yeah, and this is interesting because I mean the German constitution was written immediately, well, shortly after the war, and certainly British lawyers had a hand in writing that, which is always amuses me that people over here say, we're British, we've got this British tradition of having this constitution, and it creates stability and all the rest of it and prosperity. And yet, when it came to us writing a constitution for Germany to try and avoid a repetition of what happened in the previous 50 years, we wrote a federal Republican constitution because that was going to be the best guarantee of stability and peace. But the federal thing, and there's been a couple of comments, I think, about federal systems and confederal systems, which are sort of just a much looser federation, I guess. I mean, Britain is historically very centralized, but of course we've had 20 years of devolution to Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And of course, Northern Ireland used to be devolved previously as well. But I think that devolved culture is becoming stronger. So there is a question about how one head of state represents all those different parts, I guess. But I mean, Germany is quite it's not homogenous, I don't think, from one part to the other. But it's an interesting issue which we haven't really looked at in any great detail. I want to thank Jack Anderton for suggesting that I'm in my late 30s. So that's very good of you. And
I
would like to thank
having not turned 30, I was somewhat
40.
sorry about that, but sure.
Yeah, so just to answer some of these questions about federalism, whatever, from the UK perspective. So, I mean, it's a bit of a complicated thing because England makes up 85% of the British population. So, it'd be, if it is properly federated, with each constituent nation having a parliament, it would be imbalanced. But I mean, there are arguments for having a devolved English parliament. or English regions and so on. It's not something which we really get into, but I think there are arguments about further change, but again, we don't really get into that as a campaign. We stick to the big sort of national UK constitutional questions. The question about we often get suggested the sort of thing you were talking about, Ollie, about having the speaker kind of acting as that head of state. I mean, my view on this is that, I mean, I don't know how you choose your speaker, but actually that speaker is chosen independently by the MPs. It's a free vote, and they decide independently of the government who it is. Then that person has to be independent of all parties, and they have a job to do, which is very distinct, and it's only for the lower house. Now, I think you've only got one House of Parliament. Is that right, Ollie?
It's exactly, and it's the same. The speaker is elected by the members of Parliament, and at that point, the speaker is supposed to leave politics behind and basically be a public servant.
I think there's something in that maybe, but I think that in the UK that would cause some conflict of interest, perhaps. I think I think there is a serious national role to play for an independent head of state. I think if you look at Scotland, Scotland obviously is not an independent state, but it has its own parliament and it's a single chamber. It was designed so that you wouldn't expect to have one party being in a majority, but for one term of that parliament, last term, for the previous election, the Scottish National Party had a complete majority, and there was no real division of power left anymore. There was no sort of head of state type figure. There was the opposition no longer had any control or power to check and balance. There was no upper house to provide that check and balance. So it was just one party in control of everything, and I think that's problematic. I think that sort of defeated the purpose of having the electoral system that they had. I think the more the power is shared out amongst institutions, the better.
Absolutely, I agree with you. On the other hand, there is a pragmatic argument here saying that to set up a republic, it's easy to sell people on a system that's basically already in place. So from an argumentative standpoint, it's easy to go out and say like, okay, well, this is the system we have. And if we remove these parts and just put them there instead, you see how easy it is. And then that removes sort of the idea that this is a very hard process.
Yeah, it comes down to the existing structures and culture that is going
exactly.
To decisions. Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that within the parliamentary model option, one of the things that is sometimes discussed is who chooses the president, because of course in Ireland it's directly elected. There are methods of nominating. I can't remember exactly what they are, but you can't just put yourself forward. To be nominated, you need support from a certain number of people in the national parliament, or a certain number of local councils can nominate. And the only person that can nominate themselves is a sitting president if they are in their first term. So that kind of narrows the number of candidates. I think they had 7 in the last, not the last, well, they just had the election recently, I think, where Michael D. Higgins got re-elected, but the one before that, there wasn't a sitting president contesting, and there were, I think, I might be saying that it was 2011, and there were 7 candidates, and it was a really interesting debate about who they wanted to have, and Michael D. Higgins comes from a minority party background. He's not he's not put in there by one of the major big 2 parties. So, but then in other parts of the world, it's Parliament that chooses, and I think that this is one of the arguments they're having in Australia, where over direct election or parliamentary choice. And I think that aside from anything else, voters are going to want to choose, if there's going to be a separate head of state, the voters will want to choose that person themselves rather than let MPs do that job.
Yeah, but in my version, like, the head of state would still be the prime minister. even if you have some ceremonial power in the speaker, which we do right now. It's just we add on some responsibilities there. And I feel like we do not have a directly elected prime minister either, but it's oftentimes pretty, I mean, it's either the prime minister or the leader of the opposition, basically. And of course, you can have minority governments where a much less popular person, so to speak, in matters of votes could potentially form a coalition and become a prime minister. It's happened before. But essentially, you know what you're voting for in those cases, and you rarely see a prime minister that hasn't been on the table, so to speak, during the election season. So,
yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, Marsha Simpson James here has raised an important point, which is really, wasn't that point? It's better up. A written constitution is an obvious imperative, but I think you've got written constitutions, haven't you? In Netherlands and Sweden, we don't. So,
Yeah.
This is part of the problem that we have. Is I mean, we can get rid of the monarchy and have a republic without a written constitution. Parliament has the power to get rid of the monarchy without a referendum, and can do it overnight. You know, it could be gone next week. But I think there is an argument that it needs to be written down and codified and made very clear. I'm going to do on our own YouTube channel do a video about this. I was going to I told you before we started that I now have a prop. So this is the British Constitution, basically, in a nutshell, a hat. So the crown is where all power comes from in the UK, and that has a very real impact on the way things are done. So there's a slightly bigger job rather than just removing the monarch. There's a bigger job in terms of becoming a republic in every sense.
Good point. Yeah, again, that I think that is a good point. And as Ola just said, is that people think that for our countries, as I think that Sweden and the Netherlands are more comparative, it's not that difficult to switch from monarchy as it is right now to a republic. Yes, you would have to change the constitution, but basically that's it, and then you can get to a parliament and put the real power in parliament. Just remove the figure of the king. It's not going to be that difficult.
And I think it's possibly simpler in other European countries because I mean, there are some powers and privileges that your monarchs have. I think ours are much more embedded into the constitutional structure, as it were, still. So it's a little bit more complicated, perhaps.
Well, I must say, no. It's not as if it's just one pinstripe, and that's the end of the Dutch monarchy. Our king is, if you look at the amount of times we name our king in our constitution, it's just like an endless list.
Yeah.
But basically, it's just one figure, and if we just get rid of this one figure, that's it. It doesn't really change. We don't have to change the parliament. We don't have to change the way we form our government at this particular time. In that sense, it's going to be very easy. And I think if the Dutch would ever choose to become a republic, it would be the one that is easiest to achieve.
And yeah, I agree with you on that one, Flores. And we published a pamphlet basically with that title, like just a stroke of the pen, where we argued the same thing. Like you can just remove these parts, and yeah. So yeah, I think you have a great point there.
Yeah. Someone when we talk about Germany, someone commented. I can't see it now. So pointed out we have a German monarch. Not quite true, but they have. Well, I mean, the family is still German to a large extent. Although I think we Am I right in saying that all of the royal families are related? I don't know about the Swedish one, because wasn't the Swedish king appointed by Bonaparte and Napoleon?
Well, yeah, when the Vasa lineage died, yeah, we got a French dude. But I feel like it's on the yeah, they're related through some. I'm not sure, but some cousins or whatnot. But I think so. Yeah, if I recall correctly, they're on your list somewhere, very far down in the lineage of throne. But yeah, I can't remember that off the top of my head.
Yeah. Just, I think it's worth mentioning, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but Suda Rangkupan, greetings from the Kingdom of Thailand, where a lot of youths rise up bravely demanding for reform of the monarchy. I think, definitely take my hat off to the Thais who are currently standing up to the monarchy for, in a way which is hopefully going to bring some change there. I mean, what I do for a living would end me up in jail in Thailand at the moment, but I think they've stopped prosecuting at the moment for criticising the king. So yeah, good luck to the Thais as well. I mean, we we have it reasonably easy compared to some parts of the world with monarchs, and yeah, absolutely, more power to the elbow. The other thing that would be interesting as well, and I think this is probably worth a point. I think we're going to coming up towards the end of this chat, but obviously Barbados was mentioned in one of the comments as well.
Yeah.
Not had a chance to do something on this in Republic. They've announced they want to become a republic. It's not the first time they've done that, but I think the speculation is more likely to happen now. I think that will start to inform this discussion that we're having tonight about what model is going to be most acceptable, because Barbados is going to have to choose a model, and I suspect it'll be a parliamentary. I think most broadly support the status quo, but just simply get rid of the monarchy. And as Emery Hurst has said, it's easy for Australia to become a republic. And yeah, I mean, the Australian written constitution, I'm an Australian citizen, naturalised many years ago. I lived there for a long time. It's a very good constitution. They really do just have to, I mean, they could almost just say, right, okay, the Governor General is now the head of state, and just leave everything alone. I mean, the debate is a little bit more complicated than that, because people do want to think about how that person is chosen, and at the moment they're chosen by the Prime Minister. But I think that if Barbados does it, I think there's a good chance that Jamaica will go down that road, and probably the rest of the Commonwealth country, or certainly the rest of the Caribbean countries that have the Queen as their head of state. And it will probably hasten the departure of Australia, followed quickly by New Zealand and quite possibly Canada as well. And I think that will be a big opportunity for all of us, because it answers that question: what is the alternative? Then we will say, well, you know, what's wrong with what Australia's done, or Canada, or Jamaica, or Barbados? And I think that will be one of the challenges we have, is getting over that sort of hurdle of imagining what the alternative is, you know, and sort of worrying about what the alternative might look like. And so, well, actually, it's pretty easy, you know. Australia has done it, and everything's working just fine, you know. And you can imagine the president of a new Australian republic doing a state visit to London and standing next to the Queen and or King Charles, and you know, the contrast will be a huge opportunity to say, well, we ought to do the same here as well. So I think there's this question of what the model is going to be helped enormously if countries like Barbados move along.
I saw that question coming by already a little bit earlier. Shall I just start with that?
Yeah, go ahead.
To the angry midget. Of course, I think you know, the whole idea of becoming a republic means that you are getting more democratic. For now, in the Netherlands, it's allowed to start any political party with any view. So if you want to have a political party based on a system from the Middle Ages, a system that most of countries in the world are getting rid of, Yes, you can. But I think that as soon as you do become a republic, the whole idea of monarchy is not that tempting anymore. So, but yes, it is very, in Holland, it would be, yeah.
And I can only agree. I mean, it has to be allowed to have that opinion. So, yeah. Of course, I really do think that once the monarchy is abolished, few people would actually want to reinstate it.
Yeah, and no, I agree. I mean, I think that what would happen, I mean, I've often been asked in debates, you know, okay, so you're a Democrat, so let's say we have a referendum and you lose, you know, will you accept the result? And it's like, well, of course. But the next day, I'll be organising to campaign again and to persuade people to agree, and we'll have another referendum later down the track. And then people say, oh, well, you know, if you're going to keep on having referendums, would you allow for a referendum to restore the monarchy? It's like, well, of course. You know, if people are successful in campaigning and they persuade people to go back to being a monarchy, then they should have a referendum and vote on it. But I do think that, you know, I don't think there's a single monarchy in the world that's been restored democratically, you know, as a result of a vote. You know, Spain's king was put back on the throne by Franco. The Cambodian monarchy was restored as part of a UN peace deal that hasn't exactly led to democratic government. And no other monarchy, I think, has been restored. But, you know, people lose interest. It's not that important to most people anyway. So, you know, once they get the hang of voting for, or get into the habit of voting for their head of state, they're not going to want to lose that opportunity. So, yeah. I think we're going to wrap up now because we're just pretty much out of time. Mason Bell asking about grassroots, so we'll get onto that. I'm going to do a Republic video. I'm going to try and do some stuff where members and people can get involved and chat and ask questions about us, but because this is the AERM thing, I won't get too much into Republic specific things. What I'd say is this is the last of a series. They are then recorded. You can find them on the pages where they've been broadcast. So it'll be on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, so you can watch them later, share them, obviously tell people about your respective campaigns and get people joining and donating and so on. We'll come back with another series of these, not necessarily with the same 3 countries represented. There are 7 countries in the AERM, the Alliance of European Republican Movements. So that's Netherlands, UK, and Sweden here. There's Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and Spain. So maybe we'll get some of those involved as well. If you have any suggestions for topics which are not nation specific, which are things which we can talk about across the European within the wider European context, then get in the comments and of any of the pages and suggest those ideas. You can also email secretary@aerm.org with any suggestions or comments as well, and that comes through to 2 or 3 of us, I think. So yeah, thank you very much for all your comments, and I hope that's been fruitful and interesting. Like I said, please do get involved and support your national campaign, and we will see you when the next series starts, whenever that's going to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you.